Hey guys, in this week's episode, I have the author of a beautiful, beautiful book. I'm actually considering this book to be the book of the year when it comes to your health and optimizing your body. And the book is An Epidemic of Absence, a new way of understanding allergies and autoimmune disease. And the author is Moises Velasquez-Manoff. He has written extensively, mostly on science and environment for the Christian Science Monitor. His work has also appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Chicago Tribune, and the Indianapolis Star. Among other publications, he holds a Master's of Arts with a concentration in science writing from the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. He was born in New York City, raised in New Mexico, and educated in California. As a toddler, he jumped roped in the Lower East Side. As a kid, he frolicked in the mountain streams and desert shrublands of northern New Mexico. But the reason why I got Moises on the show today is because I was absolutely profoundly affected by the knowledge, the research that he presented in this book. And I think you guys are going to absolutely love the show. We're going to be delving into things such as, is H. pylori actually healthy for you? Are we looking at autoimmune disease in the wrong way? Because there's such a prevalence in autoimmune disease today. And the question is, like, why is it happening? And we keep on blaming things such as gluten, such as dairy allergies, but I think it goes much deeper than that. And also such dogmatic things we're going to be talking about, such as parasites. And believe it or not, in Moises' book, we talk about certain parasites are quite beneficial for you today. So please sit back and relax and enjoy the show. But before we actually begin today's episode, I just want to thank everybody out there in the Optimal Nation for being so awesome. Because honestly, guys, without your support, without everybody talking together, communicating together, and helping each other out, this wouldn't be possible. So from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank everybody out there who takes their time every day, who is willing to sacrifice their time to better themselves and better their family.
It's time to talk health and nutrition. Are you ready to live a healthier lifestyle? Let's optimize your health. Welcome to The Optimal Show. Ameer Rosic is a registered holistic nutritionist and a functional medicine practitioner. His life is dedicated toward the natural predilection of a healthy lifestyle. Stay tuned for excellent interviews with some of the most renowned medical professionals in the industry. From paleo to fitness to nutrition and psychology, this is one show you'll want to subscribe to. And now, let's welcome your host. Here's Ameer Rosic.
And welcome to another episode of the Optimal Health Show. We have a fantastic show for you today. We have the author of An Epidemic of Absence, a new way of understanding allergies and autoimmune disease. The author is Moises Velasquez-Manoff, and he's joining us today. Moises, where are you joining us from?
I'm from Berkeley, California.
Oh, Cali. Nice, nice. The West Coast. Beautiful out there.
Yeah, it is, actually.
It's fantastic. Right, yeah, it's hard to compete when you have the sun all year round compared to winter. But the reason I brought you on the show today is I read your book about 1 month ago, and I was blown away. I'm like, finally, someone's actually talking about different aspects of autoimmune disease and thinking differently. And that's the reason I have you on the show today. So if you could tell our audience listening out there, what actually drove you to write this incredible book?
Well, I have allergic and autoimmune diseases. So I have the sort of standard ones. Allergic diseases are diseases where you respond to proteins in the environment. So I've had food allergies to peanuts and sesame my whole life. I have asthma, a little bit of hay fever, sort of the bevy of standard allergic diseases that are so prevalent these days. And I also have an autoimmune disorder called alopecia areata, where beginning around age 12, my hair started falling out. And that was because my immune system had made a mistake and attacked my hair follicles, eventually leaving me almost entirely hairless.
Wow. So that was basically the catalyst that drove you into writing this book?
Yeah, well, so that was why it was a sort of personal quest where I always wondered why did this happen? Doctors couldn't really explain it. Not to you go to a doctor and you say, not only fix me, which they couldn't do very well either, but why did this happen to me? And they definitely could not address the second question. So when I was starting out as a science writer, I thought, well, I wonder what has happened in the science of these disorders in the past, since I came down at least with alopecia, which was at that point more than 15 years earlier. And what I discovered was that there were no cures, but there was this really interesting body of research sort of snowballing that suggested that we had co evolved with certain organisms, both microbes like bacteria and even a few parasites, and that their removal in the previous century, but really in the previous 60 years, had changed the way our immune system worked in a way that made it more vulnerable to all the diseases that I had. And so I, of course, followed the thread, which led to this was sort of trail of crumbs, which led to this kind of amazing revolutionary body of science, which is still developing and will hopefully yield answers, in the next decade or so. Yield treatments, really, is what we want ultimately. But as you alluded to in the opening, this is a completely new way of looking at some of these very, very mysterious and also they cause a lot of suffering, these diseases. The one I have is mostly cosmetic, but there are other ones that are much worse, like inflammatory bowel disease, which is where you inexplicably have inflammation in your intestine. It's very painful. It can cause osteoporosis. It's very debilitating, can shorten your life ultimately. And many people who have it have to have large segments of their intestine removed because it gets so scarred up. That's where there's multiple sclerosis, where you sort of have this creeping paralysis over time. So these are not all necessarily cosmetic diseases. In fact, most of them are much more serious. So it would be nice if we could take this new way of thinking about these things and apply it toward having some fixes in the near future.
Amen to that. I see them doing it even as we speak right now with the whole fecal transplant, and really now addressing, even with the U-Biome project, actually genetically mapping out our own bacterial DNA, which is absolutely fantastic. But one thing I really love about in the book that you mentioning is comparisons between, say, third world country and first world country, and the whole hygiene hypothesis, meaning they don't live in sanitized environments as we do, but yet they don't have a prevalence of, say, celiac or autoimmune diseases as we do.
Yes, that's exactly right. And it's from those kinds of observations that some of this work was pursued. So, if you go, say, I'll use it at one of my favorite examples is Finland, one of the richest countries in the world, borders Russia, and the region of Russia that it borders is one of the poorest regions of Russia, which is generally considered an industrialized country, but it has very poor areas. And this area actually used to be part of what was called the Grand Duchy of Finland before World War II. And then after World War II, a chunk of it ended up in Finland. So what does that give you? A population of people who are genetically Finns, who speak a Finnish kind of language, derived language, who are stuck in a Russian environment, which is materially much poorer. And what you see in that Russian environment, is a higher abundance of oral fecal infections like hepatitis A, which is not necessarily life-threatening. It's just generally a mild infection that if you get it as an infant is probably not that dangerous at all. You might not even notice. Also, Helicobacter pylori, which is one of these really interesting bacteria that can cause both harm, and it has become infamous for causing harm, like stomach cancer, but which also increasingly seems to benefit us by preventing asthma and possibly some other inflammatory diseases, and which crucially has been with humans probably since before we left Africa, which is over 60,000 years ago and beyond, a long time. So anyways, in that environment, what you see essentially among those people who have the exact same genes as the Finns in rich, clean Finland is they have about 1/5 the prevalence of celiac disease, about 1/5 or 1/6 the prevalence of type 1 diabetes. And this is an autoimmune disorder, usually childhood onset, where your immune system turns against your insulin producing cells in your pancreas, and you end up dependent on insulin. That's a dramatic difference. This is not like a half this is, far less. And those prevalence rates in Finland, in that region called Karelia, are more or less the same as the prevalence rates 50 and 60 years ago in Finland and in the United States, for that matter. So what seems to have happened is that that region stayed frozen in time, um, in that environment, which more resembles what the world was like in poorer countries, or still is like in poorer countries, but what it was like in richer countries 60, 70 years ago. Let's just say pre-World War II to make it easy to think about. And the prevalence of the disease is also much less. And so it sort of highlights this, what epidemiologists have observed over time, which is that these diseases have increased, especially in the last half of the 20th century. It's hard to know if those increases are due to improved diagnosis. That's always a question. The studies like that demonstrate that no, they're not. Here you have people living in an environment that resembles 50, 60 years ago, and the prevalence rates are about what we actually see in the historical record 50, 60 years ago. So it's a very good sort of example of and then, as you alluded to, around the world, generally speaking, you find this pattern that the more the world is full of parasites, full of oral fecal infections, full of untreated water, a lot of mud, full of animals, full of other people, the less these diseases arise.
Exactly. They just had an article out on I think it was the New York Times, where they're talking about celiac, and they're actually comparing, say, I think some areas in Siberia and Russia compared to United States, and they're like, okay, let's just take for the 1 second that both parties are eating the same types of bread. They're both exposed to gluten and the gliadin. But why is it that in the Russian territory, they don't even have any pretty much cases in comparison to the United States, right? So that's what they're trying to, it's kind of the same lines as your book, that the environment is more conducive to the outcome of your health.
Yeah, that was actually the same population that I was just referring to. It's in it's called Russian Karelia. It's in the sort of the Finnish part of Scandinavian peninsula as it juts up into towards the Arctic. But yeah, that's exactly right. There's something going on in the environment. And what's interesting, especially with regards to celiac disease, is there are all these arguments that we're not, we started eating grains relatively recently, so we're not adapted necessarily to eating grains. Well, the archaeological record suggests actually humans have been processing grains for quite a long time, longer than agriculture, probably possibly 30,000 years, maybe 20,000, definitely 20,000 years. And anyways, to come back to your point, we know that right now people can be exposed to the same amount of those proteins that provoke celiac disease, the gliadins and the glutenins and so on, and not develop the disease. So there's clearly some additional environmental factor that is important, and a lot of scientists are putting their money on changes to the microbes inside of us, and those microbes, of course, come from other people, but they also come from the environment at large.
Yeah, definitely. And there's one point in the book, it was quite fascinating. There's some researchers in Ethiopia, and they're actually doing investigations with worms or parasites, I should say, and allergies within children. And they've noticed a remarkable thing, that the children without the worms or the parasites actually had allergies, and the ones that had the worms didn't have allergies.
That's right. That's another whole branch of this science. Parasites are very peculiar because it's a large animal that lives inside you, basically, a relatively large animal. This is not a single cellular, not a bacterium. So for one large animal, relatively large animal, to live inside another, it has to manipulate your immune system. So what it does is it tamps down on inflammation, because inflammation is it's like your gun. You take this gun and you shoot at the invader. That's inflammation. So it basically somehow manipulates that, muzzles your gun, so to speak. And as a bystander effect, you end up not reacting to allergens in the environment. So if you sort of expand your view a little bit and you say, well, those things were always present, those parasites throughout our evolution, which they were most likely, and all the evidence suggests if you just look around in the animal kingdom, there really are no animals that don't have parasites. Then we were always operating under this slight immune suppression, which means that we were probably much less sensitive to allergens when parasites were present. And of course, that's what they see in Africa. Pretty over and over, they observe that kids with worms are less likely to respond to allergens in tests. They're less likely. Populations with worms are less likely to have allergic disease. And so the idea would be to either develop a worm, which is actually in the works, that we can take that's safe, because worms do have costs. They can possibly make you sick. And develop a worm that's safe for us to take that just prevents allergies or cures allergies, or to figure out what the molecules those parasites secrete to manipulate our immune system and create drugs from those molecules.
Yeah, when I was reading one section of the book, it was quite fascinating. There's some individuals, and obviously they were protected in the book, that on their own accord, they went through certain countries to actually acquire these eggs of the parasites. But these individuals had, say, a severe IBS or Crohn's, but the positive benefits they actually acquired from doing this procedure of manually injecting worms with them, it was quite astonishing.
Yeah, well, that's testament to how intolerable some of these diseases are. I mean, if you can imagine your natural aversion to the idea of a parasite, and then overcoming that aversion because you feel like you're suffering so terribly, and you feel like this even an iota of hope with this rather repulsive creature is better than continuing to suffer. That should give you some idea of how desperate some people are. And yes, people are doing all sorts of things. I should point out, though, that you don't really know if something works unless you do a real scientific study on it. And so there are lots of reasons to think that they work. And I interviewed people for whom it clearly did work. I also interviewed people for whom it did not work, and it's hard to know the ratio. But as parallel to this, people taking their health into their own hands and seeking cures that seem to occasionally work, there's actual real work going on by scientists on people looking at, where they control it, where it's placebo controlled, so some people don't get anything, maybe, where it's blinded so that the researchers and the people don't know what they're getting, so that we can actually really test this in a rigorous fashion. And it may be soon that we actually have a parasite that's covered by insurance companies, amazingly enough.
Wow, that'd be impressive. Well, it kind of makes common sense. Like, if you look at our ancestors, and not too long ago, like, pre-industrial revolution, they're eating locally, and the plants have symbiotic relationships with mycorrhizae that feeds them minerals from the rocks, and now we're eating the bacteria from the plants, from the soil, and probably small eggs of parasites, who knows. So we were in the presence of all sorts of bacteria and parasites locally around us, which affects and controls our own gut environment.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, for most of human evolution, and we fertilized our own vegetables and crops with our own feces, because that's the smart thing to do. You save. I mean, feces is a very rich source of plant nutrients. So that basically guaranteed that people were constantly exposed to parasite eggs. Not to mention that for most of human history, we didn't have a clear understanding of how these things were transmitted. So you would tend to sewer just kind of ended up everywhere all the time. So you're exposed to a constant cycle of these infections. And of course, that was exacerbated in the last 10,000 years with people settling down and living in cities and towns, where before they were just sort of maybe nomadic bands that were temporarily stationary. But what's interesting about that is that it's the very genes that are associated with autoimmune disorders seem to have been positively selected for since agriculture. So that suggests that those genes help us as the pathogen load gets worse. That is, as the threat of infection gets worse, as things get more crowded, and as we, in a sense, basically stew in our own feces more and more. But what's important to understand is that those genes that predispose to autoimmune disorders now clearly do not, as we just talked about, in other environments, in those very environments that they evolved in. And therein is the puzzle and possibly the answer to not developing these diseases in the future.
Yeah, I'm also curious to see that certain geographical locations of tribes and cultures. Meaning, is there something to the fact that, say, maybe my ancestors originate from Eastern Europe mountains for the last 5,000 years, compared to somebody who was living in Asia, right? So obviously that's different soil context, different bacterial composition, different food, different environment. So, obviously I'm looking at the human race as not all of us have same microbes in our bodies, right?
Yeah, well, for the microbes, it depends what we're talking about. We're not all going to be exposed to the same infections because, as you say, there are different. There's an ecology of the infectious landscape, and just like a certain tree grows in one area but not another, same pathogens are not going to be prevalent everywhere. But that said, historically, as you're probably aware, the it's our body that is the ecosystem for these pathogens, and the human body is the same. From the tip of South America, almost the same, I should say, with some variation, from the tip of South America all the way to Scandinavia. I mean, so you can have a pathogen that takes in one place, it'll take in the body in the other place. It's almost guaranteed, and that's what you see throughout history. Is that things like like smallpox or like tuberculosis, they will spread through the human population uh, if the human population is a continuous, sort of as if it were a continuous forest that they could just travel through. Um, that said, of course, there are different parasites that are native to different kinds of ecological situations. Like there are in the tropics, there are generally more sort of parasites that like the schistosomes that they wait for you in water, and they basically pierce through your skin and then go find a vein, and they can live for like 40 years in your body. Those don't exist in places like the far north, but in the far north there are other kinds of parasites that don't exist in the tropics. And what's important to understand, I think, is that no matter where you're from, you may not have the same parasite, but you had a parasite depending on your diet, um, depending on how cold it got in the winter, and that sort of thing. So almost without a doubt, you had some parasite.
Yeah, that's right, and that's a thing right now in the world of health. Is like, for example, people are talking about there's always an scapegoat, and we talked about it earlier. For example, H. pylori. Everyone says, yeah, it's shown in studies. Yeah, it can cause ulcers. Yeah, it can be a serious problem. But you alluded earlier that, well, wait a second. We've probably been living with H. pylori for a very long time, thousands and thousands of years. Why all of a sudden is it not protecting us from what it's originally meant to do, right?
Yeah, well, the question is, there are several questions there. The first issue with H. pylori is that it tends to cause cancer and gastric ulcers, but those are usually afflictions of that come late in life. So as you know, people didn't used to live as long as they do now. So you can always argue, well, it never caused problems because you were usually dead already when you would have gotten the problem. Um, that doesn't seem to be entirely true, though. It does actually, when they do these studies where they compare the same age groups in different places, or what have you, or across time, it seems to have caused disease more recently rather than in the past. And one explanation is that, you usually, it seems, no one really knows how you get H. pylori, but it seems you probably get it from your mother. Kids usually end up with their mother's strain, so that we've been getting it later and later. And so when it arrives early, your immune system can sort of accommodate it better. The reason that it causes cancer and ulcers over time is because there's this chronic inflammation, this irritation that just goes on forever, and that ends up leading to a mutation or something in a cell line that ends up turning into a cancer. But if you accommodate it and you don't respond to it, you don't respond with an inflammatory response, then you can basically harbor it without troubles, right, in the long term. And that's what seems to happen, at least according to the rodent studies. When you give it to an animal earlier, it has less of an inflammatory response, and it doesn't seem to have these problems, doesn't develop these problems. So one idea about how we used to get it is that in a dirty environment where mothers probably pre-chewed food for their kids rather than buying sterilized baby food, as they do now, they probably passed it on at weaning or maybe earlier to their children. The children's immune system became more accustomed to it, and then they harbored it throughout their life without problems, without the negative consequences. And then there are these possible consequences beyond even preventing allergic and autoimmune disease, like it may protect against infection by much worse bugs. That's still somewhat hypothetical at this point, but there are some observations that support the idea that people with Helicobacter pylori have like less diarrheal disease and that sort of thing.
Well, it's interesting when you see like so many people do have issues with it, and also, many other different bacterial infections, and then they try to take set protocols against them, doing triple, like right now, standard for H. pylori is a triple round of antibiotics. In the alternative world, you're talking about specialized herbs, botanicals, etc. But a lot of people fail at the end of the day to, code in, code out, eliminate the H. pylori. And then you have to then pause for a second and then think about, well, why isn't H. pylori leaving my body? Well, maybe because it needs to be there, and because we're not giving it the proper set environment to co-thrive within us. It's acting the way it's acting, and you alluded to earlier, maybe it is then activating certain sets of genes that shouldn't be on in the first place.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are two issues there. It's possible, actually. There's some really interesting research where, because of the antibiotic resistance problems that you mentioned, they're looking at a different approach, which is that instead of getting rid of it, why don't we tolerate it better? And one way to tolerate it, it seems, at least according to some experiments on rodents, is that you introduce even a second probiotic bacteria. So there are these interesting studies done on mice, where mice better tolerated Helicobacter pylori. That is, they harbored it without problems if they also had a second bacterium present. And I don't remember the exact which one it was. I think it was a lactobacillus species. So it's another possible explanation for why in the past it may not have caused so much problems in humans. Is that it's generally pretty well accepted that we've lost bacterial diversity as inside of us, as we've moved from rural sort of subsistence farming kind of lifestyle that probably involved a lot of fermented foods to urban lifestyle that's where everything is clean, water, food, and of course we all have this sort of built-in fear of dirt.
Yeah.
So there's that aspect, but I should emphasize that if your doctor says get rid of your H. pylori, they're usually it's because it's causing problems. So probably listen to your doctor, because there are like certain kinds of stomach cancer that actually will go into remission if you just get rid of the Helicobacter pylori. If you just stop that constant irritation, that's something you want to pay attention to.
Definitely. And I'm glad that you touched on a certain point in the book, and you're just going back to the hygiene and rural farming. There's like a huge rampant rise, and it's been going on, I guess, just from the start of the Industrial Revolution, but C-sections, right? A lot of people are having C-sections today, and people don't understand that when you're actually when you have natural birth through the vaginal canal, that you actually then attain certain microbes from the mucus of the vagina. But since you're having a C-section, you escape that beneficial immunity from your mother.
Yeah, that's right. About 1/3 of women, by last count, have birth by C-sections. In the United States, I think in some countries it's even higher, like Australia. That's a lot.
Yeah.
And a lot of them they're not medically necessary. They're sort of, you schedule your birth kind of C-sections. So one potential workaround to that is, if you need to have a C-section, is the doctor can take some of the secretions and basically swab the baby when it first comes out with the mother's secretions, if that turns out to be important. Um, the other thing that that seems to happen if you don't encounter those microbes as you come out through the vaginal canal is that you're first colonized by microbes from the doctor's skin and from the nurse's skin. Those are not the same microbes that inhabit your mother's vaginal canal. And in fact, there's this really interesting thing that happens right before birth where where the mucus, the secretions start changing and they end up selecting for a very specific ecosystem of microbes, almost as if it's preparing to inoculate the baby with those. And then, of course, some of those microbes also come out in breast milk and they're transmitted, until weaning. And breast milk, of course, scientists are discovering has all these prebiotics that actually only feed certain bacteria. I mean, it's kind of remarkable that you spend all this energy manufacturing sugars, the mother that is, that only bacteria can eat. That should tell you something, that those bacteria are important.
There you go. Exactly. And that's very overlooked aspect today. And I'm not too sure. I think people are forgetting the value of having a natural birth. And that leads me to my next question is, there's a huge rampant rise lately of autism going around, globally speaking, and you hit certain points in your book talking about it. So if you want to just briefly touch base on your take on the connections with, say, bacteria and parasites and autism.
Well, the main connection with what I talk about in autism is that over and over studies, now some very big studies, these have been replicated actually since my book came out. Some of them have been replicated, but that a mom having an autoimmune disease increases the child's risk of autism. A mom having a allergic disease increases the child's risk of autism, and a mom having a metabolic disorder, being overweight, having metabolic syndrome, increases a child's risk of autism. All three of those categories of disorders have an immune component of sort of inflammation. Now, there's different ways you get to this potentially the same place, but what the animal studies seem to suggest is that those things those proteins that occur in an activated maternal immune system, they can cross the placenta and then they end up interfering with the fetal brain development, right? So this is one sort of very interesting explanation for the rise in autism, which of course not everyone accepts as being real, but I think there's a lot of evidence suggesting it is real. It's one of these things that's hard to, you can't go back in time, so you don't know that if it's how much is improved diagnosis and how much is just a better ascertainment. But you talk to most people who work in this field and they say, I 20 years ago, I never saw this many kids with this many disabilities. So in any case, what that suggests is that the immune system dysfunction that seems to have occurred as a result of our loss of contact with bacteria, with some parasites, is affecting pregnancy, which shouldn't be that surprising, actually, because the immune system is very important in pregnancy because you basically have to tolerate a foreign body inside of you. So imagine if you just mess around with the calibration of the immune system. You can imagine that pregnancy would become a little bit more difficult, or something might go wrong, might go wrong more often. And autism may be one result of that. That the brain is probably exquisitely sensitive to perturbations during pregnancy, especially immune perturbations, because for reasons no one quite understands, the same immune system proteins are used by the brain during its development. So, everything in the body is involved in many different jobs. So the immune system, the cytokines, they're called, the proteins, help neurons migrate where they need to go. Right?
That's right. And that's a fascinating thing that I was reading about in your book, is that certain parasites actually control the interleukins, the cytokines, capability of delivering their messages.
Yeah, well, they increase certain cytokines or decrease others, or so, and you can imagine that we evolved in one paradigm, in one sort of in one pattern of cytokine activation, where we had so many of these chronic parasitic infections that all our anti-inflammatory cytokines were always elevated, you know, because we were always dealing with one or another chronic parasitic infection, from tuberculosis to intestinal worms. And then you add to that our internal microbes that are purely beneficial, possibly. Um, they have also shifted, and it seems that the Western diet, which is high in fat and refined carbohydrates and salt, that actually cultivates a community of microbes that's actually inflammatory. It inflames you. It's kind of one of these recent discoveries that's emerging as being very important. Um, so you add to that the dietary changes, the lack of exposure, the lack of transmission of what you could call heirloom microbes, the lack of exposure to parasites, and you sort of can see that the part of your immune system that controls inflammation has been dramatically weakened. It's not exercised anymore.
Yeah, that's right. It's not put under a hormesis type of state. Exactly, not exercise. And it perpetuates exponentially from generation to generation, getting weaker and weaker and turning on set genes that shouldn't be on in the first place. Now, you mentioned earlier that there's a good possibility of us developing, say, certain parasites for clinical use. Where do you see this, say, like 30 years from now, with all this research from your book and more studies coming out? Where do you see us in the world of microbes and parasites in the next 30 years?
Well, that's a hard question. Ideally, what we'd see are treatments that incur no costs and convey only benefits. So, parasites are sort of gray area organisms because they clearly confer some costs. But if you're looking at inflammatory bowel disease or multiple sclerosis, that cost is minuscule compared to the benefits. You know, if they can possibly cure that. So I would imagine that there'll be multiple approaches. We're all genetically very different. The immune system is the most polymorphic, most diverse area of our genome, of all the areas, and that's because diversity in itself is one way to fight off pathogens. So in any case, there will be different ways of dealing for different people, so to speak. And that will be one of the approaches of personalized medicine. Well, they'll genotype you and say, okay, you have this genotype. This responds well to fecal transplants. This one responds well to, or it'd be more like this constellation of genes responds well to parasites. And maybe they'll even have the kind of parasite that they'll be like sort of, and I should add to that parasite question that an idea by a scientist at Duke University, where he says the parasites of the future that we use for medical purposes to nudge our immune system towards health will be to their wild ancestors what modern lap dogs are to the ancestor the wolf. So basically, we will breed out all the ferocity of the parasites, and this is completely possible. We've done it many times without even realizing it, like in the example of dogs. And then just have what we really want from the animal, which in the case of a lap dog is like love or whatever it is that people get from lap dogs. And in the case of a parasite that has been bred for that purposes will be just beneficial immune modulation and like no cost, no anemia or no stealing of B vitamins or what have you that they do, because they do take things from you, as I said. That's where I see us going.
Yeah, it's very exciting times with a lot of technology developing, specifically in the world of both human genetics and bacterial genetics, which is really cool. And specifically now with the increase in popularity of people willing to do fecal transplants, which holds huge promise towards many different ailments. So Moises, if you had to summarize, what would you tell our audience is your number one optimal health tip to do?
Number one optimal health tip?
Yeah.
Well, I wish I had something better because my number one optimal health tip would be to eat well, exercise, and try to manage your stress, which is not in my book at all, but which strangely enough can send your immune system in some sort of into these weird states that are pro-inflammatory. Now, eating, there's enough evidence now, because food is this place where microbes, your gut is where microbes and food interact. So you basically are cultivating your microbes with what you eat. So eat things that you can't digest. Stay away from processed food. Stay away from too much grease. Eat real food, and eat whole foods. That's fruits and vegetables, whole foods, as much of that as you can. Omega-3 fatty acids, good. Just stay away. You do yourself a great favor by staying away from junk food, from the excess sugar like sodas, and especially when you're pregnant, when you're actually programming the baby's immune system. Your immune system, however your immune system is working, is going to affect the baby's immune system possibly decades later. So that's a really important time to think about these things. And of course, exercise. I mean, exercise, as I'm sure you know, as I can tell from your website, is actually a very strong anti-inflammatory sort of activity.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. All those tips are fantastic. They're simple that people can utilize and do right away. Moises, where can people find you and learn more about you?
You can go to my website. It's Moises VM, V is a Victory, Amazon Mary, .com. Or you can find my book on Amazon, An Epidemic of Absence. But my website is a good place to start.
Yeah, I tell everybody, get the book. It's actually my #1 book I read this year. It's a groundbreaking work. I guarantee you guys that you will not read another book this year that can top this one. Moises, I want to thank you so much for coming on the Optimal Show. Definitely would love to have you back on when you write book #2. Till then, have an amazing time.
All right. Thanks so much for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to The Optimal Show featuring registered holistic nutritionist Ameer Rosic. How about that awesome guest Ameer just spoke to? So, what did you think? Do you want more? Oh, do you? Awesome guests are foreseen in the near future. As a matter of fact, next Monday seems like the perfect date. Be sure to tune in for another spectacular show where Ameer speaks with some of the most renowned guests in their respective fields. Have you joined the Optimal Tribe yet? If you haven't, you are missing out. Visit AmeerRosic.com and sign up by typing your name and email in at the top of the front page. You'll receive information about health, exercise, nutrition, and much more. Until next time, stay healthy.